The radio intercept came in at 0341. A Ukrainian signals unit operating 12 kilometers southwest of Pokrovsk pulled it from the air. A burst transmission, fragmented, clipped at the edges by terrain interference. The analyst on duty ran it through pattern-matching software. The call signs matched, the frequency matched, and the grid coordinates, once decoded, pointed to a staging area that Ukrainian reconnaissance had been watching for 6 days. The 90th Guards Tank Division was moving. Not a probe, not a feint. A genuine armored push, company-sized, aimed at widening a salient that Russian planners had spent 2 weeks trying to develop southwest of Pokrovsk. The division had committed tanks, not just infantry fighting vehicles, not just armored personnel carriers, but T-72B3s and T-80BWs, the armored fist that Russian doctrine reserves for breakthrough operations. What happened over the next 60 hours would be documented frame by frame, drone clip by drone clip, satellite pass by satellite pass. 15 armored vehicles, 1 contested kilometer of open farmland, 3 separate assault attempts across the same ground, 3 times. This is the story of how one of Russia's most recognized armored formations fed itself into a grinding machine it could see, could measure, and could not stop. That question, why Russia kept committing armor to a sector already mapped by Ukrainian reconnaissance, sits at the center of everything that follows. And the answer, when it comes, says something uncomfortable about the state of Russian armored doctrine in the 3rd year of this war. Let's reconstruct it from the beginning. Southwest of Pokrovsk, the terrain is not dramatic. This is agricultural Ukraine. Broad fields of winter wheat and sunflower stubble, flat to the horizon in most directions, interrupted by isolated tree lines running along drainage channels, and the occasional rise of a spoil heap from old mining operations. There are no mountains here, no rivers wide enough to anchor a defensive line. The geography rewards patience and punishes exposure. By mid-May 2026, the front in this sector had stabilized along a ragged line that Ukrainian forces had been holding since the previous autumn. The 90th Guards Tank Division, headquartered out of Chelyabinsk in peacetime, had been operating in the Donetsk direction for over a year. It is among the Russian Army's most recognizable armored formations, carrying a lineage traced back to the Second World War. A fact Russian state media referenced frequently, as though pedigree could substitute for tactical competence. The strategic logic behind the push was legible enough. Pokrovsk sits on the intersection of several key supply routes for Ukrainian forces operating in the western Donetsk region. Russian planners had been trying to pressure it from multiple axes for months. The salient southwest of the city represented an opportunity, a wedge driven into terrain that, if widened, could theoretically threaten Ukrainian lateral movement and force a reallocation of reserves. Ukrainian forces in the sector knew this. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, elements of which had been rotating through this stretch of line since February, had positioned anti-tank teams along the likely approach corridors. FPV drone units from a detachment affiliated with the 414th UAV Brigade had established firing positions in tree-line concealment with line-of-sight coverage over the primary agricultural tract the Russians would have to use. And they had already called in detailed grid coordinates for the staging area where the 90th's armor was assembling. Satellite imagery from a Maxar Worldview 3 pass on the morning before the push showed the concentration. 20-plus armored vehicles clustered in a field depression 4 kilometers behind the line of contact. The image was time-stamped, geolocated, and passed through Ukrainian intelligence channels within hours. By the time the 90th's company commanders were giving final orders to their crews, Ukrainian anti-tank teams had already rehearsed engagement sequences for the approach corridor those vehicles would have to travel. What's most surprising about this case isn't the Ukrainian preparation. It's that Russian intelligence had to have produced similar assessments, and the push happened anyway. The tactical situation was not hidden. The risks were not theoretical. And yet, At 04:20 on the first morning of the 60-hour window, the first column moved. Here's where the first obstacle appears, and it matters for understanding what followed. Ukrainian drone crews operating that night encountered a problem that OSINT analysts would later identify in the geolocated footage. A low cloud ceiling and intermittent ground fog had reduced effective FPV range over the approach corridor. The first Russian column, 5 T-80BW tanks and 2 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, moved under cover of this meteorological window, and the initial drone passes couldn't achieve clean targeting angles. For approximately 40 minutes, the Russian column advanced further than Ukrainian planners had anticipated. Then the fog lifted. Partially. Enough. The first engagement sequence played out in 11 minutes. An FPV operator, whose drone footage was subsequently geolocated by open-source analysts using field edge alignment and a distinctive spoil heap visible at bearing 047, released 3 strikes in succession. The first drone impacted on the lead T-80BW, penetrating the engine deck and stopping the vehicle. The remaining column, caught in the open with the lead vehicle blocking the track, attempted to disperse into the adjacent field. The second strike caught a BMP-3 attempting that maneuver. The third struck a T-72B3 that had pulled to within 8 meters of a tree line attempting concealment. 3 vehicles in 11 minutes. The column halted. Surviving vehicles reversed. The first wave of the 90th Guards Tank Division's push had stalled 400 meters short of its objective. The wreckage was geolocated by 2 separate OSINT accounts within 12 hours, matching the drone footage to Maxar imagery that showed 3 vehicle-sized burn scars at the precise coordinates the footage implied. Ukrainian General Staff reported the engagement that evening without specific vehicle counts, that accounting would come from open-source analysis, vehicle by vehicle, clip by clip. Now here's the part that defines the entire 60-hour sequence. The 90th didn't stop. This is what we spent considerable time working through in the available footage record, and one detail kept returning as the central problem. Russian armored doctrine, as written and as practiced in the Donetsk direction, treats company-sized armor pushes as discrete tactical events. If the first company fails, the assessment is that conditions were unfavorable. Timing, weather, coordination, not that the approach corridor itself has been permanently mapped and covered by anti-tank systems that have now ranged the terrain to the meter. The interval between first and second attempts was approximately 18 hours, long enough for the fog to clear completely, long enough for Ukrainian drone crews to recharge batteries, reposition, and receive additional munitions. Not long enough for Russian commanders to conclude that the same kilometer of open field should be approached differently, or not at all. The second push committed 4 T-72B3 tanks and 3 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers. The BTRs were carrying dismounted infantry, which suggests Russian planners had concluded the first failure was an armor-alone problem, that adding infantry would suppress the drone operators or provide enough dispersal to complicate targeting. It didn't. The terrain had been rehearsed. The firing positions were established. The FPV crews had spent 18 hours watching the approach corridor and refining their engagement geometry. The second column entered the coverage zone and encountered fire within 6 minutes of crossing the same landmark, a field access gate, geolocated in 3 separate drone clips that the first column had used. 4 vehicles from the second push were confirmed, destroyed, or mission killed over the next 90 minutes. 1 T-72B3 was struck and immobilized, but did not immediately catch fire. It was subsequently struck again by what drone footage suggests was a second FPV strike approximately 22 minutes after the first impact, consistent with Ukrainian doctrine of re-engaging damaged but unburned vehicles to prevent recovery. The BTRs fared worse. Their lighter armor, effective against small arms and shell fragments, provided no meaningful protection against the shaped charge warheads that FPV drones were carrying in this sector. 3 BTR-82As were struck, 2 burned. One was abandoned by its crew, which the drone footage captured withdrawing on foot toward the tree line to the east. That footage, soldiers on foot, moving away from a burning BTR, circulated widely on Ukrainian military telegram channels within hours. It was geolocated to a specific field near the village of Yelizavetivka, southwest of Pokrovsk. The coordinates matched the sector where Ukrainian signals intelligence had placed the 90th's operational axis. We dug through the available drone clip archive and cross-referenced with satellite imagery. The second-wave vehicles are visible in before and after Maxar imagery, appearing as new burn scars in the same field corridor, a few hundred meters advanced from the first day's losses. 7 vehicles in 2 waves, the same kilometer of open field. And here's where the arithmetic becomes uncomfortable for Russian operational planning. A T-72B3 costs approximately $3 million. A T-80BW, with its more capable turbine engine and improved reactive armor suite, runs closer to $4 million. A BTR-82A, roughly $1.5 million. The 7 vehicles destroyed in the first 2 waves represented somewhere between $20 and $25 million in equipment alone, before factoring in training, maintenance, and the crew losses that accompanied at least 4 of those vehicle kills. The Ukrainian FPV drones that achieved most of these kills cost between $300 and $800 each, depending on payload configuration. The cost-exchange ratio across those first 2 waves exceeded 10,000 to 1 in Ukraine's favor. Put yourself in the position of a Ukrainian anti-tank team commander watching the second wave take the same approach path as the first. There's a particular kind of cold, professional satisfaction in that moment, not because destroying equipment is inherently satisfying, but because correct preparation producing correct results is one of the only reliable certainties in this kind of war. They had predicted the corridor. They had covered the corridor. The corridor produced exactly the results the preparation was designed to produce. The question that military analysts and OSINT communities were already beginning to ask, even as the second wave burned, was whether a third push would come. It would. And this is where the 60-hour window reaches its defining moment. The third attempt came 18 hours after the second, which meant it fell during daylight hours, mid-morning, when drone visibility is highest and thermal masking from ground temperature differentials is minimal. Ukrainian drone crews had optimal operating conditions. The 90th committed its third company-sized push, 6 armored vehicles, a mix of T-80BWs and BMP-3s, with what drone footage suggests was an attempt to use a slightly different approach azimuth, angling from the east rather than directly from the south, apparently hoping to find a gap in the coverage arc. There was no gap. The terrain had been fully mapped. The firing positions covering the eastern approach had been established before the first push, because Ukrainian planners had identified it as an alternative corridor during their initial reconnaissance. The third wave lost 8 vehicles in 2 hours and 14 minutes of engagement. This is the point in the analysis where commentary often reaches for dramatic language. Catastrophe, devastation, carnage. We'll resist that framing because what matters more than the emotional register is the forensic precision. Each of those 8 vehicles can be individually accounted for in the drone footage archive. Each loss can be tied to a specific firing solution, a specific FPV impact, a specific moment in a documented sequence. Vehicle 1, T-80BW, struck on the forward hull, catastrophic detonation of the ammunition load, crew compartment destroyed. Drone clip time-stamped and geolocated to the eastern field approach. Vehicle 2, BMP-3, struck on the engine deck, fire spread to the ammunition storage, vehicle burned for approximately 40 minutes. Visible in satellite imagery as the most northerly of the third wave burn scars. Vehicle 3, T-80BW, struck twice. First impact penetrated the rear hull. Vehicle lost mobility. Second impact from a re-engagement drone completed the mission kill. Vehicle 4, BMP-3, struck while attempting to reverse through the column, collided with a following vehicle before being hit. Both were immobilized. The collision itself is visible in drone footage, a moment of mechanical chaos that illustrates how quickly a disciplined armored column can disintegrate under drone-heavy pressure. Vehicles 5 and 6, two T-72B3s that attempted to break to the west into open ground away from the approach corridor. The move took them out of the original firing arc, but into the coverage zone of a second FPV team positioned for exactly that contingency. Both were struck within 90 seconds of each other. Vehicle 7, BTR-82A, struck attempting to extract wounded. The ethical calculus of targeting medical evacuation is complicated. Ukrainian doctrine and international humanitarian law create obligations around marked medical vehicles. This BTR was not marked as a medical vehicle, was armed, and was engaged as a combat asset. Vehicle 8, T-80BW, the last functional vehicle of the third push, attempting withdrawal. Struck at approximately 400 meters from the engagement zone, engine deck penetration, vehicle fire. 8 vehicles, 1 engagement window, the same kilometer of ground, 3 times. Here's the take that will generate argument. The 90th Guards Tank Division's loss rate near Pokrovsk during this 60-hour window is not primarily a failure of the soldiers who crewed those vehicles. It's a failure of the command structure that committed them. Crew members following orders to drive across a field that had already destroyed 7 vehicles from their own formation are not making tactical decisions. They're executing orders that someone above them had determined were acceptable. The accountability for 15 destroyed vehicles sits with the operational planning process, not with the men in the turrets. That framing matters for how we assess Russian military dysfunction. The problem isn't that Russian tank crews lack courage. The problem is that the system they operate within doesn't translate tactical failure into operational reconsideration fast enough to prevent compounding loss. 15 vehicles over 60 hours, a single approach corridor, a formation that crossed the same ground 3 times with the same result. Now, what does the confirmed loss total actually represent for the 90th Guards Tank Division's operational capacity? According to Oryx open-source data tracking, verified through visual confirmation of individual vehicles, the 90th Tank Division has been among the most heavily attrited armored formations in the Russian order of battle since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. By May 2026, confirmed losses attributed to the division across the entire Donetsk front ran to well over 100 vehicles, representing a substantial fraction of its pre-war equipment holdings. The 15 vehicles lost in this 60-hour window near Pokrovsk represent, by the Oryx methodology, approximately 12 to 15% of what the division had assessed as operational at the start of the engagement window. For context, a tank division operating at 85% capacity is considered capable of offensive operations. A division that loses 15% of its operational vehicles in 60 hours to a single contested approach corridor has a command problem, not just an attrition problem. The satellite before and after imagery made available through commercial providers tells the same story in a different register. The field southwest of Pokrovsk that these 3 waves attempted to cross appears, in the post-engagement imagery, as a distributed pattern of burn scars and vehicle hulks. The clustering is not random. The scars group along the approach corridor concentrated in the zones where Ukrainian anti-tank coverage was densest, with the third wave's burn scars forming an arc as vehicles attempted to break from the primary axis. Intercepted communications, released through Ukrainian military intelligence channels, though the specific source authentication cannot be independently confirmed by this analysis, suggest that Russian commanders in the sector attributed the first wave's failure to drone conditions and the second wave's failure to coordination problems. Only after the third wave did the internal assessment shift toward acknowledging that the approach corridor itself was untenable. This is the doctrinal problem the 60-hour window exposes. U.S. defense officials briefing on Russian combined arms performance in the Donetsk direction have repeatedly noted the gap between Russian doctrine as written and Russian doctrine as practiced. Soviet and Russian armored doctrine, developed around mass, momentum, and operational depth, assumes a pace of advance that keeps adversary defenses off balance. An enemy that can reposition, resupply, and rehearse countermeasures between waves has broken the fundamental assumption that the doctrine depends on. Ukrainian anti-tank teams, FPV drone units, and the broader reconnaissance architecture that maps approach corridors in near real time have systematically broken that assumption across the Eastern Front. The result is that Russian armored formations commit to approaches that are already mapped, already covered, already rehearsed. And the commitment doesn't stop after the first failure because the command structure lacks a fast enough feedback loop to change course. What's happening here is worth sitting with for a moment, because it connects to a pattern this channel has documented across multiple engagements along the Donetsk axis. Russia's armored doctrine is calibrated for a tempo of war that this war is not allowing. The reconnaissance strike complex that Ukrainian forces have assembled, combining commercial satellite access, FPV drone networks, signals intelligence, and ground-level OSINT, closes the observation orientation decision action loop faster than Russian operational planning can adapt to it. By the time a Russian company commander is issuing orders for a third wave, Ukrainian drone crews have already repositioned for the eastern approach arc he's about to use. Here's what this tells us about the larger strategic situation along the Pokrovsk axis by late May 2026. The Russian push to widen the salient southwest of the city did not succeed. The approach corridor that the 90th Guards Tank Division spent 15 vehicles and 60 hours attempting to force is not in Russian hands. The salient did not widen. Ukrainian forces in the sector remain in position, having absorbed the push and extracted a 15-0 vehicle loss exchange in their favor. For Russia, the attritional arithmetic of feeding an armored division into mapped, covered terrain is unsustainable at scale. A division that loses 15 vehicles attempting to advance 400 meters in 60 hours cannot sustain that operational tempo across a front measured in hundreds of kilometers. At that exchange rate, the offensive capacity of the 90th Tank Division degrades faster than any reasonable reinforcement timeline can offset. If you've been following this war seriously, you already understand why this matters beyond the immediate tactical result near Pokrovsk. Russia's approach to the Donetsk front has, for over a year, relied on a logic of replacement. The assumption that production rates, mobilization reserves, and equipment transfers from storage can outpace battlefield attrition. That logic faces a direct empirical test every time a formation like the 90th commits armor to a contested sector and loses vehicles at rates like those documented in this 60-hour window. The 60-hour window near Pokrovsk is, in miniature, the same test German panzer formations faced in Normandy in June 1944, when Allied air power and the breakdown of operational surprise turned armored strength into immobile wreckage before it could concentrate. The specific weapons are different, FPV drones rather than Typhoon fighter bombers, but the structural dynamic is the same. A reconnaissance strike capability that closes faster than armored doctrine can respond, turning mechanical power into vulnerability rather than breakthrough. The question that comes out of this engagement, and the one that military analysts are actively working through, is whether the Russian military is capable of the doctrinal adaptation this situation demands, or whether the institutional rigidity that sent 3 company-sized columns across the same kilometer of open ground in 60 hours is too deeply embedded to change within the time frame that matters. Based on everything the OSINT record shows across the Donetsk front through May 2026, the evidence for meaningful Russian armored doctrine adaptation is limited. The same approach corridors appear in after-action footage from engagements separated by weeks. The same engagement geometries recur. The same vulnerability to drone-heavy anti-tank tactics manifests in sector after sector. The 90th Guards Tank Division near Pokrovsk is not an outlier. It's a case study. Comment below. Do you think Russian armored doctrine can adapt fast enough to change the attritional trajectory before division-level forces run below operational threshold? We read every response, and the military analysis community has genuinely divided views on this. That question connects to three larger implications this 60-hour reconstruction points toward. The first is the FPV drone as the decisive weapon of this phase of the war. The 15 vehicles lost in this window were not primarily destroyed by HIMARS, not by javelins, not by artillery, and not by armored counterattacks. They were destroyed by drones costing between $300 and $800 each, operated by crews who could engage, reposition, and re-engage within a single hour. The industrial logic of this exchange, cheap precision striking expensive mass, has not yet been fully absorbed into Western military planning, despite the evidence accumulating from this front every week. The second is that the reconnaissance architecture making these kills possible is not just a collection of drones. It is a system. Satellite imagery feeding target identification, signals intelligence feeding movement prediction, ground-level FPV creating the final targeting solution, and open-source verification closing the battle damage assessment loop. The integration of commercial satellite data, civilian OSINT networks, and military targeting is a genuinely new operational capability, and Pokrovsk is one of the most recent demonstrations of how mature that capability has become. The third is that the question of Russian replacement capacity is not academic. If the 90th Guards Tank Division loses 15 vehicles in 60 hours attempting to widen a single salient, and that rate of loss is replicated, even approximately, across other formations on other axes, the Russian military's ability to maintain offensive pressure in Donetsk faces structural limits that mobilization alone cannot solve. Equipment is harder to replace than personnel. Trained crews are harder to replace than vehicles. A tank division that has lost a third of its trained operators and two-thirds of its pre-war vehicle inventory is not the same formation, regardless of what replacement vehicles are nominally assigned to it. Could Russia have prevented the losses in this 60-hour window? The honest answer is, not easily, given the constraints. The 90th Guards Tank Division was under operational pressure to advance. Refusing to push would have meant acknowledging the corridor was untenable, which would have required a broader reassessment of the approach to the Pokrovsk salient. Those decisions get made at Army group level, not company level. The soldiers who died in those vehicles were not in a position to choose a different outcome. How does this change the calculus for armored operations across the Eastern Front? NATO military planners watching this engagement have confirmation of something they've been modeling. FPV drone saturation of an approach corridor can achieve kill rates against modern armor that previously required artillery or close air support at a fraction of the cost and with substantially less infrastructure. The training requirement for effective FPV employment is lower than for precision artillery. The industrial base required to produce FPV munitions is within reach of mid-sized industrial economies. The implications for how future combined arms operations are structured extend well beyond this war. And the forward-looking question, the one that shapes the next chapter of the Pokrovsk fight, if Russia cannot force the salient wider through armored assault, what is the operational alternative? Infantry-heavy infiltration tactics? Heavier use of glide bombs to suppress drone operators before committing armor? A shift to a different sector where Ukrainian reconnaissance coverage is thinner? Each of those alternatives has its own costs and vulnerabilities, and Ukrainian planners are working through the contingencies in real time. What's next near Pokrovsk will be documented as it happens. The 90th Guards Tank Division has not been withdrawn from the line. The salient still exists. The approach corridor that cost 15 vehicles is still the most direct route to the objective that Russian planners originally identified. Whether a fourth push comes and what form it takes will tell us whether the 60-hour window produced any learning at the operational level. We'll be watching. If this investigation, built frame by frame from drone footage, satellite imagery, and open-source unit tracking, is the kind of analysis you want every week, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We cover the Russia-Ukraine front with the same forensic approach, vehicle by vehicle, coordinate by coordinate, engagement by engagement. 3 questions to close on. Could the 90th Guards Tank Division's losses have been prevented if Russian Army Group commanders had read the reconnaissance picture the way Ukrainian planners read it and chosen a different axis or a different method before committing armor to a covered approach? The evidence suggests the reconnaissance picture was available. The question is why it didn't produce a different decision. How does an engagement like Pokrovsk change the doctrine calculus for NATO members considering their own armored modernization timelines? If FPV saturation can achieve these kill rates against T-72 and T-80 variants, the implications extend to every armored formation operating in similar terrain. And European terrain is, in many sectors, structurally similar to the agricultural approaches southwest of Pokrovsk. And what comes next? The 90th Guards Tank Division will be reconstituted, reinforced, and committed again. The approach to Pokrovsk will be attempted again, through some vector. The question is whether Ukrainian reconnaissance will have mapped it before it happens, and the evidence from this 60-hour window suggests the answer is yes. Watch this space.